The Dark Scrolls. What if I told you that one of ancient Rome's most bizarre emperors wasn't a man of war, political cunning, or imperial tradition, but a teenage boy priest from Syria who transformed the Eternal City into a theater of ritual blood, gender-bending pageantry, and scandalous ceremonies? His name was Elagabalus, and for 2 millennia history has wrestled with how to remember or forget him. This is not merely the story of a Roman ruler. It's the story of a boy who rose from obscurity to command the greatest empire on earth and dared to force it to kneel, not just to his authority, but to a foreign god, to a different idea of love, and to a vision of power that Rome neither understood nor forgave. Born around the year 203 CE in the sun-drenched city of Emesa, modern-day Homs, Syria, Varius Avitus Bassianus was no ordinary child. He was born into the Severan dynasty, Rome's ruling imperial family. But it wasn't politics that shaped his early world. It was faith. His bloodline connected him to emperors, yes, but more crucially, it bound him to the sun. Not the Roman soul, but a far older, wilder deity. Elagabal. Elagabal wasn't a god that could be sculpted into a statue or painted onto a temple wall. He was worshipped in the form of a sacred black stone, smooth, meteor-born and veiled in mystery. The rituals dedicated to him were ancient, Eastern, and utterly alien to Roman custom. There were drums and incense, ecstatic chants and sacrifices that dripped blood onto stone floors. As the hereditary high priest, the boy didn't just serve the god, he embodied him. By the age of 14, the boy priest was already leading elaborate ceremonies in Emesa's hilltop temple, his body draped in gold and silk, his face painted like a living idol. But he had no idea that history was already preparing to pull him from the incense clouds and place him on the most dangerous throne in the world. The moment came with the death of Emperor Caracalla, a violent and divisive ruler assassinated on the roadside by his own guards. Rome reeled. Power shifted like sand in a storm. Into that vacuum stepped Julia Maesa, the boy's grandmother. Sharp as a blade and unyielding as marble, Maesa was a master of Roman politics. She had seen her family's power dwindle under the rule of the usurper Macrinus, and she knew that only something shocking could restore it. So she spun a lie that was, in Rome's eyes, almost a miracle. She told the soldiers stationed in Syria that her grandson, the boy priest, was in fact the illegitimate son of Caracalla himself. The resemblance was vague at best, but in an age where oracles and omens weighed heavier than blood tests, the claim held weight. More importantly, she bribed them. Gold, promises, favor. And the soldiers, restless and hungry for new leadership, hoisted the 14-year-old boy onto their shields and declared him emperor. From that moment on, Rome was no longer a city of certainty. He crossed the Mediterranean not as a Roman prince, but as a living vessel of an Eastern god. His first act was to take a new name, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, to align himself with the Antonine legacy. But no one remembers him by that name. To the people, the Senate, and to history itself, he was simply Elagabalus, named for the deity who burned brightest in his soul. At first, Rome was curious. A boy emperor was unusual, but not unprecedented. Perhaps they thought he would be guided by advisors. Perhaps he would be molded into a Roman. But Elagabalus had no interest in shedding his past. Instead, he dragged it into the heart of the empire. His first decree: the god Elagabal would not be a foreign visitor in Rome. He would be its king. The sacred black stone, Elagabal's physical presence, was brought from Syria in a golden chariot. It was paraded through the streets like a triumphant general, guarded by priests dressed in shimmering robes, their eyes painted with kohl, their fingers stained with sacrificial blood. Roman citizens watched, stunned, as the boy emperor danced ahead of the procession, not as ruler, but as high priest. On the Palatine Hill, where Rome's most sacred temple stood, Elagabalus ordered the construction of a new sanctuary, the Elagabalium. Made of marble and gold, draped in purple and incense, the temple was dedicated not to Jupiter, king of the Roman gods, but to the sunstone of Emesa. And there, the emperor proclaimed, Elagabal would reign supreme. Jupiter would kneel. It was more than a religious act. It was a declaration of war on Rome's soul. In Roman tradition, religion was not just faith. It was identity. It was law, hierarchy, ancestry. To tamper with it was to tamper with the foundation of the republic, the empire, and the gods themselves. Elagabalus wasn't just introducing a new deity. He was rewriting the divine order. He didn't stop there. He declared that Elagabal had taken a Roman wife, Vesta, goddess of the hearth. It was a symbolic union meant to merge Eastern and Western divinities, but to Roman ears it sounded like sacrilege. Vesta's priestesses, the Vestal virgins, were sworn to chastity. They were the spiritual guardians of the city's flame, and now one of them was being symbolically married to a black meteorite from Syria. The Senate was forced to attend rituals they didn't understand, to kneel before a foreign god, to participate in ceremonies laced with drums, fire, and blood. Some whispered that human sacrifices were offered in secret. Others said the emperor entered trances, speaking in tongues, his eyes rolling back as the god spoke through him. Rome had seen madness before. Nero playing the lyre while the city burned, Caligula naming his horse a senator. But this was different. This wasn't Roman madness. It was something else entirely. Something foreign, something deeply unsettling. And as the gods were redefined, so too was identity. Elagabalus's personal life became a lightning rod of scandal. He married 5 times, including once to a Vestal virgin, a crime so blasphemous that it was said to curse the city. He didn't merely sleep with men, he called them husbands. Most famously, a charioteer named Hierocles became his public partner. The emperor lavished him with wealth and titles, presenting him at court in ways that made senators grind their teeth. He dressed in silks and veils, wore makeup in public, and preferred to be addressed as lady or queen. At night he would sneak out of the palace dressed as a woman, offering himself in taverns, not in disguise, but as performance, as ritual. Some claimed he asked surgeons to find a way to turn him into a woman entirely. Whether these stories were true, distorted, or born of political smear campaigns remains debated by historians. Ancient writers like Cassius Dio and Herodian had no love for the boy emperor. They may have exaggerated, they may have lied, but they didn't invent the sense of unease Elagabalus inspired. To the Roman elite, gender was law as much as empire. Men ruled, women obeyed, and the emperor embodied the masculine ideal, powerful, stoic, unflinching. Elagabalus shattered that mold. He didn't bend gender, he broke it. And Rome wasn't ready. But while senators fumed and priests panicked, the people watched in awe. The emperor's processions were dazzling, gold-leafed carriages, dancers covered in petals, fountains that ran with wine. He hosted banquets where guests drowned in roses, literally, according to some accounts, suffocated under heaps of blossoms dumped from ceilings. He staged marriages between gods, animals, even stars. No boundary was sacred, no rule was unbroken. In these surreal performances, Elagabalus wasn't simply mocking tradition. He was enacting a vision a Rome reborn in myth, in ritual, in a blending of worlds that refused to accept hierarchy. In his Rome, gods were fluid, love was unbound, and power was not about the sword, but the spectacle. But Rome, in the end, was not a city of spectacles. It was a city of control. By the year 220 CE, Rome was no longer the city it had been just 2 years before, at least not in spirit. Though the temples still stood and the Senate still met, the Eternal City seemed to breathe differently under Elagabalus. It pulsed with a new rhythm, faster and stranger, as if some foreign incense had soaked into its bones. And beneath its marble skin, discontent grew like a hidden crack, long, jagged, and inevitable. Inside the palace, the emperor continued to live not as Rome expected, but as the god he believed he embodied. Mornings began with elaborate rituals in the Elagabalium, where incense curled upward like whispers, drums echoed against ancient stone, and masked dancers circled the black meteorite in patterns older than any Latin prayer. Cassandra-like priests imported from Emesa spoke in tongues and poured wine onto fire. Elagabalus himself would appear not in a toga, but in silks, perfumed and jeweled, his expression distant, his eyes rimmed with kohl. He rarely spoke during the rites. Some said it was because he was listening, to the god, to the stone, to something even deeper. What disturbed the Senate most wasn't just that their emperor had become a priest. It was that he seemed to have no interest in ruling. He signed decrees while lounging among musicians. He handed out positions of power like party favors, favoring dancers, actors, and lovers over generals and senators. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, found themselves taking orders from eunuchs in violet robes. One of them, a man named Zoticus, rumored to be another of Elagabalus's lovers, was briefly named chamberlain of the palace, to the horror of the conservative elite. Public games became more surreal than celebratory. At one spectacle in the Colosseum, Elagabalus released wild animals not against gladiators, but into the seats of the aristocracy. Lions with gilded claws leapt across marble benches. Ostriches dyed bright colors chased senators around the arena. At another event, the emperor tossed out thousands of silver coins into the crowd, except some were fake, others poisoned, and a few melted to the touch. It wasn't entertainment. It was performance art, maddening, unpredictable, dangerous. But not all of Rome was offended. Some were fascinated. The lower classes, who had long been voiceless beneath the weight of patrician tradition, saw something strangely liberating in the chaos. Here was an emperor who didn't speak like a god of conquest, but acted like a god of inversion. A man who blurred lines between ruler and worshipper, male and female, east and west. For some, Elagabalus was a living scandal. For others, he was a living challenge, proof that power could look like something else. Even so, the power he held was slipping. The Senate seethed. The generals grumbled. The whispers of mutiny grew louder with each golden banquet. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who had once built his throne, now watched with tightening lips and narrowing eyes. She had believed her grandson would be unusual, but not uncontrollable, not un-Roman. It was Maesa who devised the plan to save the dynasty. She began to elevate another boy, her younger grandson, Severus Alexander. 15 years old, quieter, paler, far more pliable. Where Elagabalus stunned, Alexander soothed. Where one provoked, the other obeyed. Maesa saw in him a return to Roman order, a chance to preserve the Severan legacy before it collapsed entirely in perfume and ritual blood. Elagabalus, to his credit, resisted. At first, he dismissed the rumors, then grew paranoid. He had several officials tortured, accusing them of conspiring with Alexander. He tried to banish his cousin, then relented under pressure from Maesa. Finally, reluctantly, he named Alexander co-Caesar, hoping it would calm the storms at court. but all it did was give them a second emperor to compare. While Elagabalus danced in his temple, Alexander learned statecraft. While the elder held ceremonies by moonlight, the younger reviewed legions and listened to jurists. And while the boy priest grew more flamboyant, his cousin grew more Roman. The empire began to look at Alexander with the same hunger it once had for Elagabalus, not because they loved him, but because he was familiar, safe. The breaking point came in the early months of 222 CE. Details are murky. Some say Elagabalus tried to have Alexander assassinated. Others claim he planned to flee Rome with the Black Stone, returning to Emesa in exile. What is known is that the Praetorian Guard, Rome's ultimate power brokers, made their decision. They no longer believed their emperor was fit to rule. On a cold March day, the guards surrounded the imperial residence. Elagabalus, sensing something wrong, attempted to flee with his mother, Julia Soamias. They ran through the corridors of the palace they had once commanded, but there was nowhere left to hide. The guards caught them near the Elagabalium itself, at the threshold of the temple that had symbolized everything Rome could not accept. The murder was brutal. Elagabalus did not die as an emperor. There was no ceremony, no last words, no honor. His body was dragged across the palace floor, stripped, beaten, and spat upon. His mother suffered the same fate. The Praetorians, no longer guards but executioners, hauled the corpses through the streets of Rome. What happened next was Rome's final verdict. The bodies were not buried. They were not cremated with rites. They were dumped in the Tiber River, the city's ancient artery. Like garbage, like waste. Their names were scratched off inscriptions. Statues were smashed. The Elagabalium was stripped of its gold and rededicated to Jupiter. The black stone was shipped back to Syria, or perhaps hidden. Its fate remains unknown. And thus came the Damnatio Memoria, Rome's official curse of forgetting. But forgetting isn't erasing, it's hiding. And even as the empire returned to its familiar rhythms, the story of Elagabalus continued to flicker in the margins, in whispered tales, in lurid histories, in symbols etched into temple foundations. The boy in silks became legend, a monster to some, a martyr to others, a question no one could answer. Was he mad, or was he brilliant? Was he a symptom of Rome's decline, or a reflection of its hidden truths? He had ruled for just 4 years, but in those years he had held up a mirror and forced Rome to see itself not as it pretended to be, but as it truly was, fearful, rigid, desperately clinging to control in a world that was already changing. And then there is the deeper question, the one the historians still hesitate to ask. What if Elagabalus wasn't merely a failed emperor or a tragic boy? What if he was right? They thought they had erased him. The waters of the Tiber swallowed the boy emperor's body like a final Roman ritual, cold, anonymous, indifferent. The river had seen centuries of blood, but none quite like his. He wasn't just an emperor fallen from grace. He was a name condemned to silence, a memory forcefully severed from the empire's proud lineage. But Rome underestimated one thing. Legends don't need to be preserved in stone. They survive in shadows, in whispers, in the sharp, unyielding ache of injustice. Elagabalus died in humiliation, not for war crimes, not for betrayal, but for being too different, too bold, too disobedient to the unspoken laws of Roman masculinity and tradition. He died because he wore makeup, because he loved men, because he danced in temples and dared to make gods kneel in unfamiliar ways, because he believed that power wasn't defined by conquest, but by conviction. Rome could forgive decadence. It had forgiven emperors who poisoned siblings, who burned cities, who killed for sport. But it could not forgive a boy who stepped into the palace in silks and demanded to be seen, not as a man, not as a woman, but as something freer, more dangerous. It could not forgive love that refused to ask permission, or faith that refused to kneel, or joy that refused to hide. And so they butchered him. The Praetorians who once swore loyalty crushed his face with their boots. Senators who toasted his arrival spat on his corpse. Citizens who had cheered his gold coins now dragged his name through mud. The same crowds who had marveled at his parades now claimed to have always known he was a monster. They didn't just kill Elagabalus, they rewrote him, turned him into a warning. The ancient biographers penned grotesque caricatures, a pervert, a lunatic, a disgrace. They described him with horror, painting his rituals as depraved orgies, his lovers as freaks, his politics as chaos. Every detail became a weapon, a twisted spectacle for future generations to mock. And it worked, for a time. Elagabalus disappeared from monuments. His likeness was chiseled off mosaics. His statues were recast in other men's forms. His god was buried under marble and his temple desecrated. For years, no one dared speak his name, but the truth has a strange persistence. Centuries later, his name began to surface, quietly, then louder. Artists painted him in strange, luminous light. Historians, once dismissive, returned with new questions. Queer scholars saw in him not a freak, but a pioneer. Not a cautionary tale, but a mirror. What if the lies told about him were fear disguised as history? What if Elagabalus was not Rome's shame, but its secret conscience? Imagine being 15 and forced to lead the greatest empire in the world. Imagine being told to crush yourself into a mold that was never made for you. Imagine choosing, again and again, not to conform, but to exist on your own terms. That is not weakness. That is not madness. That is courage. They called him monstrous because he was beautiful in a way they could not understand. They called him mad because he saw the divine in places they feared to look. They called him dangerous because he asked the question every empire dreads. What if everything you believe is a lie? And perhaps that's why the story of Elagabalus still hurts. Not because of how he lived, but because of how he was destroyed. Because his death was not a necessary end. It was a deliberate act of silencing. A punishment not for what he did, but for who he dared to be. Even now, the echoes remain. In politics that demand conformity. In religions that refuse to expand. In societies that punish softness, queerness, difference. Elagabalus was killed not just by Rome, but by every generation that prefers obedience to truth. He was a child who danced with gods, and they drowned him for it. But here we are, still speaking his name, and in doing so we undo their forgetting. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.